Um, okay. Evening, everyone. The Honorable Mrs. Lina Puriantari, the Vice Dean from the Faculty of Humanity at Airlangga University, and our foreign speaker, Professor Friederike, Assistant Professor of Comparative Development and Cultural Study, Departemen für Kulturstudien, University Passau, German. And hello, everyone. Good evening to all my participants. So, first of all, Development Study Club wants to express our gratitude for the Department of History, Faculty of Humanity at Airlangga University for the collaboration in the public discussion, especially Mr. Shakawi Hussein. And today we are going to have a great discussion about sport with Politik, Sukarno, and GANEFO, Games of New American Forces. Games of New American Forces, also known as GANEFO, were the games set up by Indonesian as a counter to the Olympic Games, so established for the athletes of the so-called emerging nation, that's many newly evident socialist states. And GANEFO held in Jakarta in 1963. There is a political issue in the sport GANEFO, which is held by the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno. It will be an attractive discussion of assimilation, political issue, and sport relation at the global political level. My name is Kyle. I'm from the Departemen Study Club and currently studying International Relations of UPN Veteran Jatim as of Surabaya. And I'm here to be your moderator. It's such a great honor to welcome you here at this event with us. Okay, I would like to read the agenda for this happening. The first opening is an opening remarks from Mrs. Lina Puriantari, a Vice Dean from the Faculty of Humanity at Airlangga University. The second, lectures from Professor Friederike as an Assistant Professor in Comparative Development and Cultural Study, University Passau, German. And the last section is Q&A session for all the participants. For the first item in the opening remarks for Mrs. Lina Puriantari from the Faculty of Humanity at Airlangga University, the floor is yours. Hello, Mr. Lina Puriantari.
Okay, thank you, Mas Khalid Syami, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much for Professor Friederike Trotier. This is really, really great that we may have you here to discuss with a very interesting topic on, let's say, sport and politics. I mean, this discussion absolutely is very important for all of us. I see here that some students and also some lecturers also join with us. And here also, I would like to thanks to our partner, Department Development Study Club, Mas Reza, and all friends, including the moderator, Mas Khalid Sami, who are working hard in preparing this seminar together with the Department of History, Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Airlangga. Professor Friederike, I know that probably this is our first encounter in this forum, Zoom forum, but hopefully next time after this discussion, we may continue with a deeper discussion, because the topic that you share with us today is very, very important in the like a national history. And here also we have the Department of History, and absolutely sport is also one of the topic that I'm sure still like under research. And this topic, I'm sure will like invite students and also lecturers here to know it more. If I can see here is the topic of Olahraga tanpa Politik, Sukarno and GANEFO is very timely topic, because this is not only talking about an event that happened in the past, that is a GANEFO or the Games of the New Emerging Forces held in Jakarta in 1960s, but how it can be a lesson to understand the interwave of politics and sport related to Sukarno's navigation on international and regional geopolitics. And here it's very interesting because Sukarno used this GANEFO as a platform through which geopolitical tension were revealed publicly. And then it seems with this way, then he's trying to get sympathy and then also support from many sides of society, including from the sport. So then, actually, I'm not an historian, but in this way, I can sense that this situation, I mean, that what happened in the past is still very relevant in today. For example, I just remember in one sport event, international sport event, the Russia, for example, cannot join, and then also the current event when there is an issue that athlete from Israel cannot play in Indonesia. I mean, those kind of things give us a kind of a lesson that in many ways, sport that we think, or many of us think is like out of the conversation of politics, actually in some ways cannot be separated from the situation. So then, Professor Friederike Trotier, we hope that today we may have a very fruitful discussion. You give us like an insight about what happened with that, and I'm sure with that then many questions will arise, and then we can continue into, I don't know if we can make a kind of a more kind of a research together in the future. Okay, thank you for a while. I will listen to Professor Friederike sharing with us. Thank you, Khalid. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you. That was a great opening remark from this leader. Thank you very much. So now we move to the next section, the lecturing section from Professor Friederike Trotier as an assistant professor of comparative development and cultural study from University Passau, German. So before we move to lecturing section, let me introduce our foreign speaker for our discussion today. Dr. Friederike Trotier, as a chair of Southeast Asia Critical Development Study, University of Passau, German, and academic careers, the first as academic advisor for comparative development and cultural research, University of Passau in 2020. Second, research assistant for Southeast Asia Study, Goethe University Frankfurt in 2012-2017. And postdoctoral project in mobile urban policy in Southeast Asia in 2018. As educational backgrounds, that the first one is Bachelor of International Business and Cultural Study, University of Passau, and Master of International Business and Cultural Studies, University of Passau, and last one is Doctoral Study in the Southeast Asia Languages and Cultures. Professor Friederike Trotier had written some outstanding papers, including Nation, City, Arena, Sport Event, Nation Building, and City Politik in Indonesia, released by NIAS Press in 2021. Second, Indonesian position in Asia, increasing connectivity and soft power through 2018 Asian Games, released by Trans-Regional and National Study of Southeast Asian in 2020. Sorry. And GANEFO, Legacy and Indonesian Relationship with the EOC, released by International Journal of the History of Sport in 2017. And the last journal is Changings and Image Stroke Sport Event, Palembang Success Story, released in Asian Pacific Journal of Sport and Social Sciences in 2017. Okay, I have the last one, sorry. Sport and body cultures in East and Southeast Asia. Professor Friederike wrote this with his friend Alan Biner and released in Asian Pacific Journal in Sport and Social Sciences in 2017. Okay, these are all about our foreign speaker, Professor Friederike. Now we have come to the lecture section about sport with Politik, Sukarno, and GANEFO with Professor Friederike. Professor Friederike, floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Selamat sore, and thanks, Prof. Lina Puryanti, for the warm introduction, and thank you very much, Mas Reza and Mas Khalid, for the invitation and now for the introduction to my lecture. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and luckily we have now platforms like Zoom to have these kind of meetings, although I would definitely love to travel to Indonesia and to meet you in person. So hopefully that will happen sometime soon, or you come to Germany and we meet at the University of Passau or somewhere else. So yeah, without much further ado, I would like to start my presentation and share my screen. So just give me a second. So do you see my screen?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I will talk about Sukarno's Games of the New Emerging Forces. And as a start, I thought it's actually nice to quote from the from the GANEFO itself. So when it was established, it said, "We peoples of the new emerging forces conscious that sports means to serve as an instrument to build men and nations, to create international understanding and goodwill, desirous to build this world anew, free from colonialism and imperialism in all their forms and manifestations, aspiring to develop a community of nations imbued with the spirit of the Asian-African Conference held in Bandung 1955, which ensures respect for each other's national identity and national sovereignty, strengthens friendship, fosters cooperation towards lasting peace and among nations and towards brotherhood of man, have agreed to develop a new international sports movement to secure the achievement of these ideals and to proclaim an international sports movement, the Games of the New Emerging Forces." As you see, I highlighted some parts of it, and in a way, when reading this passage, I have the feeling to really hear President Sukarno speaking and having his take on GANEFO right there. So to build people and nations, build identity, have a new world free of colonialism and imperialism, and particularly important, the spirit of Bandung. So this as a starter, we will definitely come back to these points later on in this presentation. So what I will talk about is first to give a bit of background about the beginnings of modern competitive sports in Indonesia. And also, GANEFO cannot be understood without discussing the 1962 Asian Games in Jakarta. So I will give a short overview on this event, and then give more details on GANEFO, and pay particular attention also to the end of GANEFO, but also the legacy, which is a bit tricky to discuss because it seems to be forgotten, but in a way it isn't. So there is legacy, and this is maybe also something we can discuss later on in our Q&A session. So about the beginnings of modern competitive sport, so it was related to the emergence of building a modern nation state in the 19th, early 20th century. And many sports that are considered modern competitive were introduced by the Dutch to the East Indies. which also means had the touch of coloniality into it, and therefore it was also quite ambivalent for Indonesians to participate or not to participate in Western sports. So on the one hand, sport gave the opportunity to become part of the colonial system, and with this to provide certain advantages to people. And it was linked to this idea of modernity, and so people could embrace the new and colonial modernity through sports, and thus also break with local traditions. On the other hand, there was often the idea that if people join sports competitions, in the end, they might even be able to beat the colonial power with its own weapons. So very a strong tool in a way to oppose the Dutch colonial power with something that the Dutch introduced themselves. When we look at the time after independence, from the beginning, sport played an important role, especially with this idea of creating a new nation and to strengthen identity and to build men and the nation. And one point was to make sport also more Indonesian after independence, and to form many clubs in different sports. And as early as 1948, the National Sports Week, PON, was established, and the first one took place in Solo. So we already see at this very early stage when Indonesia was actually still struggling with the Netherlands, and it was basically wartime in the country, but there was already the National Sports Week taking place. Indonesia also tried to participate at the Olympic Games, which didn't materialize in the 40s, but then later on. But Indonesia was also part of the foundation of the biggest sports mega event in Asia, the Asian Games. And so Indonesia joined the first Asian Games in India in 1951. So we can already see how significant sport was in the early phase of the Indonesian nation state. And this is certainly due to the president himself. So, sorry, my presentation just got stuck. Just a second, please. I just reopened it. There was some technical issue with it. Okay, let's try again. There we go. So to see this all in the context of the presidency of Sukarno, and here just to give some keywords that you're probably all very familiar with in this time of his presidency. So the introduction of guided democracy in the late 1950s, and Sukarno's attempt to combine so many different ideas and ideologies in his NASACOM policy. One important idea that he often put forward was the Indonesian Revolution. And this is not just the revolution against the Dutch and about independence, but he proclaimed an ongoing Indonesian revolution even after independence. And this was strongly linked to the sports events, as I will demonstrate later on. We have a very slow rapprochement with China, which will be important when talking about GANEFO. This was definitely not straightforward, and it was not that easy to to have good relationships with China, but it was one important aspect of Sukarno's foreign policy. He also tried to be a leader and a key figure in the non-aligned movement, and we have to see the sports events, the Asian Games, as well as GANEFO, certainly in the context of the non-aligned movement. Sukarno's idea to put forward, maybe also different forces. It's still linked with the non-aligned movement, but he basically invented the terms of new emerging forces and old established forces, and saw the ongoing struggle between these forces. I will also come back to this when talking about GANEFO. And one other important part of his foreign policy was the anti-Malaysia movement and confrontasi. So we will see all these aspects of Sukarno's worldview later on in the sports events. So starting with the 1962 Asian Games, so Indonesia managed to become the host for the 4th Asian Games. And this was, of course, linked to great prestige. And it was great honor for the country and for Sukarno to host this event. And considering that it was just less than 20 years after independence, it was really Indonesia is a young nation already on this global platform. When we look at the domestic politics, again, we can see a strong link between sport and nation and character building. And often we see this very strong rhetoric of Sukarno and in these images of Indonesia as a strong and fighting nation, or this ongoing revolution. So we have the fighting spirit and the attempt to increase self-confidence and national pride. So we have to see this all in the context of decolonization. So to boost the nation's confidence and to link this with a sport event as a platform where you can demonstrate the capabilities of a country and the great visibility of such an event. What was also very crucial to the 1962 Asian Games was the role of Jakarta. So as the capital, and also it was the time of transformation. So Jakarta became a metropolitan city. And Sukarno's idea was to really move the capital away from being a colonial capital, so away from the Dutch heritage, but rather to become the heart of the Indonesian nation, and thus to have a strong position within the country and the nation. And the Asian Games was, in a way, a trigger to build several new and modern buildings, which actually have a very long legacy. So the most prominent example being the Senayan Sports Complex, and so including the Bung Karno Stadium. And we can see the long legacy when looking at the 2018 Asian Games, where the Bung Karno Stadium was actually still in use and even renovated and so on. And also you see still other landmarks in Jakarta that remind us of the 62 Asian Games. So we have a very strong commitment to the development of Jakarta and its role as the Indonesian capital. I already discussed Sukarno as the central figure, so we can also see this in the Asian Games in particular, where he could strengthen his power and using the event as a platform for his political ideas and to put Indonesia forward as a leading country within Asia, within the third world or the non-aligned movement, and even in this very global context. Throughout the preparation and the event itself, Sukarno showed a very high commitment to the event, because it was also in his interest to be seen as a leading figure and to have successful competitions, and that the whole event was seen as successful. But beyond the domestic politics, there was a lot going on concerning foreign politics. As just mentioned, for Sukarno, it was really important to gain international recognition and to establish Indonesia also as a sports center in Asia. And something that is important for the Asian Games, and then maybe even more important for GANEFO, is this idea to connect the sports events with the Africa-Asia Conference of 1955, and to claim this as displaying the Bandung spirit. So to have the sports events as a sort of repetition of the Bandung conference, and to display post-colonial countries or the process of decolonization, and to show that the new countries in Asia and beyond have agency now. So this is kind of the key message of the Bandung spirit. And Sukarno went even so far to have the idea to reform the Asian Games and to really establish it as an event of the non-aligned movement, which even meant that he wanted to include countries such as Egypt, which is geographically seen definitely not a part of Asia, but to really link the Asian Games to non-aligned policy. And this went hand in hand with the decision to exclude Israel and also Taiwan from the Asian Games. So we see a strong political commitment of Indonesia in the Asian Games, which then started a big controversy. So before the Asian Games started, it was already in danger of not taking place because of these political decisions. And the Asian Games Federation was against Indonesia's decision on the exclusion and also the inclusion of Egypt. So this didn't happen. And in the aftermath of the event, which still took place, but it was with bitter consequences for Indonesia, so they were excluded from the IOC, or in a way, Indonesia left before being officially excluded, but it was basically an exclusion of the country. And the reform ideas that Sukarno put forward for the Asian Games failed. And consequently, for Indonesia, it was a good chance, or it was somewhat a necessity if they wanted to be important on the sports stage or in geopolitics, to come up with a counter event then in a way to the Asian Games, but even more to the Olympic Games. And this is how we come to the Games of the New Emerging Forces. So in the first place, as I just said, the event came out of the Asian Games, and we can see many similarities to the Asian Games, although Sukarno certainly stated that it was very different event and a counter event to the Asian Games and the Olympics. But when we see at the motto, for example, we have the ever onward, the motto of the Asian Games, and GANEFO had the motto onward, no retreat. Maybe a bit of a stronger message, but quite some similarity here. And also with performances and symbols, we have many similarities to the major sports events of the Olympic Games, for example. Before Sukarno established GANEFO, it's very likely that he had the idea of bringing the Olympics to Indonesia. But with being excluded from the IOC, of course, that idea was not realistic altogether. So his plan was then to host a different sports event with a similar global outreach, like the Olympic Games. And so this was also part of the motivation to establish GANEFO. And it was not just Indonesia as a driving force, but also China, which might be something we can also discuss later on. What does it mean for the relationship between Indonesia and China? So I don't focus that much on China now, because I think it makes more sense to discuss in Indonesia in more detail. The key element of GANEFO was certainly that it was a political event, and already during these controversies about the Asian Games, it was a lot about the question in how far do sports events include political issues. And the claim of the Olympic Committee and also of the Asian Games Federation was that sport doesn't have anything to do with politics, and that they manage to not mix sports and politics. And Sukarno questioned this attitude. And when we see from our standpoint now, certainly almost all sports events have somehow a political context to it and political issues. So we must agree with Sukarno that mixing or not mixing sports and politics is almost impossible. On the other hand, his solution to the problem was then to have such a clear combination of sports and politics that the political context is becoming actually even more important than the sports or the sports competitions themselves. And that again is somewhat questionable whether that works out. And we see with GANEFO that was also one of the major challenges and reasons for its discontinuity. So what happened in 1963? So we have the first GANEFO taking place in Jakarta. And when you look at the genesis, it's actually quite amazing how fast they were with staging the event, considering that it was 1962 that the Asian Games took place, and then in 1963 several countries met to think about the idea of GANEFO, and then already in November 64 GANEFO took place. And one reason was that Indonesia really wanted to have the GANEFO before the Olympic Games took place in Tokyo in 64, sorry. And so we were talking about 63 with the GANEFO, and in 64 the Olympic Games. So to demonstrate that Indonesia was still the first nation in Asia to host a significant global sports event. And considering the size, so we had 48 participating countries, which is definitely a considerable number. But we have to take into account that about 1/3 of the teams were in fact unofficial teams and not representative of the whole country or the official teams of the Olympic committees. This was, of course, due to this political confrontation going on between GANEFO and the Olympic Games. We had a very large crowd attending the opening ceremonies, and then 12 days of competition and cultural events taking place in Jakarta, again also with large enthusiasm from Indonesian spectators, similar to the Asian Games. Why Games of the New Emerging Forces? From our perspective today, the name sounds a bit odd because the term of new emerging forces has basically disappeared. It was Sukarno's idea to divide the world into struggling forces. So on the one hand, the new emerging forces, on the other hand, the old established forces. It was about this period of decolonizing and still having in mind the world setting of colonizing countries and countries that have been colonized, and to see this as a constant struggle between the forces, even in the process of decolonization or after the process of decolonization. To talk about forces meant that it was a dimension beyond the nation state, because some countries in Africa, for example, were still in the process of decolonizing. So they all were included in this aspect or in this term of forces. And the new emerging forces were countries or other entities, mainly in Asia and Africa, but also in Latin America. Socialist countries could also be included, as well as any group that linked to this idea of emerging forces or were seen as progressive groups within other countries could also join. So it was a very open term, and any kind of entity that felt links to the emerging forces could join. And again, Sukarno showed great ambition to lead this struggle of the new emerging forces. And it was, so to say, part of the non-aligned movement, but it was also his own idea to strengthen this concept of the new emerging forces and to be the leading figure. And we can see this also with other activities. So we had the CONEFO, so quite similar with the GANEFO, so the Conference of New Emerging Forces taking place in 1966. So there was a lot going on within Indonesia and the non-aligned countries, or what we call now maybe rather the global South, to come together and to join forces in the perceived struggle with the established forces. Throughout the process, we can see a navigation between confrontation and diplomacy. So with the conferences, it was also more the diplomatic way, and the sports event, GANEFO, can also be seen in this navigation. So on the one hand, it was about diplomacy as a sport event. It was seen as rather a peaceful event of cultural exchange, but there was also the confrontation with the IOC and the Western world. looking at GANEFO related to Indonesian domestic politics, we certainly see President Sukarno as the central figure, displaying himself as the charismatic leader of the country in this joint struggle of the new emerging forces. And the sports event offered another opportunity for Sukarno to show himself as a master of ceremonies, as linked also again to the Bandung conference, and these big events of global outreach helped him to display his important role and to really strengthen his position as a leader. Here, as mentioned before, it's again about the politics of the Indonesian revolution. So to have another event that could be placed in this rhetoric of Indonesian revolution also helped to kind of constantly remind Indonesian citizens that the struggle and the revolution is ongoing, and thus to have this kind of spirit of a revolution linked to sports. This was important and in a way necessary in Indonesia, considering the diversity of the nation, and there were also, of course, many conflicts going on in the country, and it was still the process of unifying Indonesia, and Sukarno was struggling to create a homogeneous and a unifying Indonesian identity. So this idea of revolution and to link this with many different events was a tool of nation building. And this again was linked to the attempt to boost Indonesian self-esteem. Related to sports, it was also linked to the attempt to disseminate sports throughout the archipelago, and to inspire the people to participate in sporting activities. So to have a very strong semangat berolahraga, so that people would join sports clubs and do sporting activities. And not, so it's not just then about the event taking place, but more about everyday sports culture. And as a kind of continuation of the Asian Games, the role of Jakarta was also still important as Indonesia's sports center, but also as an Asian sports hub. Now we come to Indonesia's foreign policies, and this is also what is widely discussed or has drawn attention because of the political nature of GANEFO. So it was placed in non-aligned policy, the important role of the Bandung spirit and Sukarno's leadership ambitions. Sukarno also stated that the Asian Games did not truly reflect the Bandung spirit. So he co-opted the Bandung spirit now for GANEFO, saying that this is the true event where we live the Bandung spirit, meaning agency for the decolonized nation, to be strongly connected with one another in this idea of friendship and brotherhood. Other very important contexts of foreign policy were the confrontation with Malaysia on the one hand and the rapprochement with China on the other hand. So in the 1960s, we had this ongoing confrontation with the newly formed Malaysian state. So Sukarno saw it just as a puppet of the British, and wanted to somehow stop the building of Malaysia as a country, and so the sports events served also as a platform for the anti-Malaysia rhetoric. And one very strong slogan was "Sukseskan GANEFO, Ganyang Malaysia." Oh, sorry, it says Malaysia, not Malaya. So to crush Malaysia, and this is part of the success of GANEFO. So to link the political foreign politics of Sukarno with GANEFO, and to have also strong sentiments here against the neighbor. In contrast, there were better relationships with other Southeast Asian countries, in particular with Cambodia. This is also linked to the Asian GANEFO taking place in 1966. And we have the rapprochement to China. On the one hand, China had its own interest in GANEFO due to its own sports and foreign policies. So China had left the IOC, and therefore it was a good chance to use GANEFO now as a platform and to support other countries or sports teams to come to GANEFO. So China was the biggest sponsor of the event, and Sukarno's politics in this time frame was also to get more cordial relationships with China. So via the sports event, this was also possible to have meetings and to get a better relationship with Communist China. We certainly have to see the whole event in the context of the Cold War. And when we look at sports events in Asia in general, they have been particularly political. And this was often due to the Cold War. And the different sports events were platforms where Cold War conflicts were actually played out. It was often about the question of China and Taiwan, also about Israel, and what kind of political, in which way countries were aligned to either side or to the non-aligned movement. So we have a lot of politics in the different sports events. And what is very interesting to see how important GANEFO was in a way in this in the global context. So we can see that the West actually feared GANEFO as a tool to spread communism, and especially the United States, but also other Western countries, tried to downgrade the event as just a communist propaganda and to describe it through a racist and colonial discourse. So there was fear, or someone was seen as a threat to the West. And another aspect is that in the 60s, there was what was called a sport and scramble for Africa going on. We had all these new countries after decolonization, or in the process of decolonization, and which side would they choose? Not just concerning the political setting, but also would they join the IOC or go to GANEFO? So there was really a struggle going on, or the run for African countries to join one of the big sporting groups or events. This materialized mainly in the confrontation between GANEFO and the IOC. So as I mentioned, it was about the question mixing sport with politics, to do it in an obvious way or maybe in a more hidden way, and claiming not to do so. So GANEFO was very political. It was the sporting manifestation of a political struggle against imperialism and colonialism. And again, we can see that the IOC also took GANEFO as a threat very seriously. So they punished, or they threatened countries to exclude them from the Olympic Games, and to really try to prevent countries from joining GANEFO. So at this time in 63, it seemed that GANEFO was quite successful, gaining international attention, but this highly political context, or the idea behind GANEFO, was so much embedded in the political setting. This was also one reason for GANEFO to discontinue in the end. So when GANEFO took place, there were already debates going on how to continue, and this was very much contested by different actors. So participants had different interests, and there was already many divisions among participants from the outset. So for example, the Soviet Union also sent some teams to GANEFO, but they rather wanted to lead the struggle against the IOC within the IOC, so to have a different strategy. And in the end, the IOC was also successful with its threat. So many countries in the end were actually not willing to leave the Olympic movement. And GANEFO was maybe not strong enough, or the appeal was not big enough to really become a second Olympic Games or Olympic movement. And as I just said, this political nature of the event was in a way a very unstable foundation, because when things changed, and they changed very profoundly, especially in Indonesia and in China, this meant that the whole setting was not the same anymore, and so the foundation basically collapsed. And this was, of course, due to Suharto's seizure of power in Indonesia, and thus Sukarno just was not able to continue his political struggle in this context of the new emerging forces, and the change then to the new order government was so profound that GANEFO came to an abrupt end, and was also, was not part of any politics of the new order. And we can see similarities in China, because China was also a strong supporter of GANEFO, but then with the Cultural Revolution, there was also so much going on in the country that there was no capacity left to continue GANEFO. Now to the last aspect, GANEFO's legacy. So it was a very short-lived event, and the idea to have GANEFO for a longer period of time and really to establish it as a counter event to the Olympic Games did not take place. And we can also see this more in the domestic context of Indonesia. So GANEFO in a way did not enter the national narrative. So this was Sukarno's plan. It was supposed to become a very crucial component of national history. And this can be seen when we look at plans for the National Museum for Monas. Sukarno wanted to have GANEFO displayed at the museum, mainly to demonstrate Indonesia's return to greatness and its role in world politics. But then when Monas was built and established in the end, that was already in the New Order regime, and so the plan did not materialize. And the dioramas that we have now from the Suharto period, of course, mirror very different ideas of Indonesia and the political worldview of the New Order. So it might be something to discuss what is displayed at Monas and might be included when we look at Sukarno's worldview, or maybe nowadays how we look back at Indonesian history. So to summarize GANEFO's legacy, we have a very limited legacy on the one hand, so due to the specific political agenda and also due to the strong dependency on Indonesia, especially on Sukarno and on China. And what we see is a more vivid memory of the Bandung Conference and also of the 1962 Asian Games, maybe as events with less obvious political character. But still, we do have some legacies of GANEFO that are maybe a bit more hidden. So in particular, when we look at the politics of sports events after GANEFO, we can see that the event still provided agency and changed the mindset of third world, of formerly colonized governments and their actions on the global stage. And GANEFO gave a voice to Asia and laid the ground for following mega sports events in the continent. And when we look at our current situation, I think there might even be a revived interest in GANEFO also to the current crisis of the IOC. So maybe to think about what might be appealing about GANEFO, or to enter the discussion about transformations of the IOC and then looking back at the history. And well, with this, I come to the end of my presentation. So to conclude, it's well, I think it was very visible that GANEFO was a political event and Sukarno's brainchild, so it can't be separated from Sukarno's person and his ideas of sports events and politics, geopolitics. But it's not such a simple story as has been told, especially by Western countries, that it was just a communist event. So the political agenda was driven by non-aligned third worldist politics and not communism. So it's important to go into detail and to look at the messages of GANEFO, even looking a bit beyond this very strong rhetoric, which must be seen in the context of the time. And yeah, maybe there's also a need to do some more research on this. So of course we have to see that there was a strong confrontational attitude and strong rhetoric, and this also contributed to GANEFO's end. But as I just mentioned in the last slide, we can still see the hidden legacies, and maybe here we can enter the discussion and see what does GANEFO mean for Indonesian politics nowadays, for hosting sports events nowadays, and the link between sports and politics in a more general and in a more global context. And with this, I would, oh, sorry, that was not almost the end, just my references. So as has been mentioned, it's so based on my own publication. Here you see my book. So if you're interested in reading some parts of it, I hope it's inspiring for you. And now I come to the end of the presentation. So terima kasih banyak, and thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to any kind of questions you have.
All right, thank you for Professor Friederike Trottier's an outstanding presentation. So we have come to the last section, is Q&A section. If you guys have any question, please raise your hand. It doesn't mean you raise your hand over there because we can see you there. So you just click and emoticon is provided in the app. So you can ask your question directly when you raise your hand. Okay, or you can raise your question in the comments below. That's some instruction from Department Study Club. Okay, if you have question, please raise your hand. Okay, we have a first question here. This private question. I love private anyway. So for Professor Friederike Trotter, this is a question for you. What do you think of Indonesian rejection to Israel in relation to the global sport event that was hostile in Indonesia recently?
Oh, so the recent events, or so I think the Indonesian reaction or attitude towards Israel must be seen generally in the context of interaction of Muslim or Muslim majority countries and Arab countries towards Israel. So of course that is a very complex issue, and sports events are just one platform to demonstrate a certain attitude or antipathy towards Israel. And well, when we look back at the events in the 60s, it was the same idea that Israel is or doesn't have the right to exist as a country. So that's basically the idea of the neighboring countries, but also of other Muslim majority countries. And Indonesia's attitude in this, I would say, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert on this, is to signal strong links with the Muslim world and with other Muslim majority countries. And maybe this is even more important than just excluding Israel, but rather to have strong links with the Muslim countries that Indonesia feels a strong connection to. And maybe this is what is revived now and plays out on the sporting stage as well. Maybe this is also something you have discussed in other settings. If there's somebody who would like to comment on this as well. Be interesting to hear. Maybe it's a very, very complicated issue with strong political ideas.
May I then ask something related
Yes,
to?
please.
Yes. I think what Professor Friederike explained to us, how we cannot see GANEFO as only a sport event, but how then it is closely related with a bigger issue of geopolitical tension, etc. at that time. So could you show if there are these kind of things also happen in other part of the world? I mean, who knows that those kind of issue also can be seen, I don't know, in other continents, like in Africa, in other Asia, like America, for example. So probably this is can be a good references for us to see how then we can see sport not only as a sport, but something related to the bigger issue.
Well, I have to admit that my personal focus is on Asia, so I'm also not that familiar with all the literature in different continents. But maybe staying a bit in the context, what we had in the 60s was the formation of an African committee, and so sports committee. So it was also the idea to have something like African games and so on. And this happened in the context of decolonization, and we have very strong political interest also from the outside, from the IOC. But then, of course, we have the United States and the Soviet Union, both trying to interfere and to get the countries on their side. So in this formation of an African, sort of African Olympic Committee or African Games, this was strongly driven by political interests. There's very interesting literature on sports under the Cold War, so that would be definitely something to recommend as readings. So I think it's a collected volume on, I think it's like Sports and Cold War or something like that. I can maybe share it later on, where you have different examples. I know it from, or I read one article about the political nature of hockey games, so ice hockey, between Canada and the Soviet Union. So throughout the Cold War, this was like very much political events as well. There was always the struggle between the communist and the capitalist countries, played out on the hockey, so in the ice arena, basically. So that's maybe one example. Well, when you look at the history of Germany, you have the two countries competing at international events. So there was, of course, also in the context of the Cold War and the struggle between West and East Germany played out at Olympic Games or other major events. So I'm sure you have a lot of examples, and I mean, in Asia, it's a lot about the One China policy that I mentioned. So whether it's the People's Republic of China or Taiwan invited to in a sports event or to certain competitions, I think there has been many studies on that. Also, the relationship between South and North Korea, where you also have the more recent example of the Pyeongchang Olympic Games or other Asian Games, where North Korea joined the event or did not join. So this was also, of course, the same, kind of similar with the setting in Germany, to have the two countries with the different ideologies where sports events often play a role also as a meeting point and maybe as a starting point for any kind of diplomatic relationship.
Thank you, Professor Friederike. Okay. There is one question here.
So it's more a comment by Ferdinand, right? So for sports fans, they tend to strongly oppose the talks about politics in sport, including Indonesian soccer fans in response to FIFA about Israel matter, but actually think we cannot deny the importance of understanding history behind politics within sports events itself. Yes, I agree on that. That there's of course a certain tension. Also, if people are enthusiastic about sport and want to enjoy sports events in themselves, and I mean, there's also a right to just enjoy games, but maybe on a more academic or from an academic perspective, we certainly need to take a step back and look at what are political interests behind events, or what is being displayed and what is maybe not being displayed, or how do countries portray themselves, and what are hidden agendas, which are often then linked to political interests. And maybe the role of fans can be very important in certain ways. They have quite a voice when you look at football or other sports where you have a lot of like big fandom. I would say it's also an actor in the arena of sports. So maybe also something to look closer at, or to see whether they can also have an agenda related to political issues. I think there's now the follow-up or continuation. So developing country, I don't think, have strong position to oppose international organizations like FIFA about sports policy. Is it possible that at this era countries can band together and have strong aspiration about sport, like Sukarno's GANEFO? Thank you very much to come up with this comment and question. I think this is precisely where I was heading at with my slide about legacies, considering that the international organizations are very strong on the one hand, and monopolize basically a sport event like the IOC, like FIFA. They're very, really big and very important and very powerful. On the other hand, when we look at recent years, they're quite in big crisis. So it's about the sustainability of events, environmental issues. It's about people in the countries that are actually fighting against staging big events, or we have cases of corruption. And so within this kind of controversial situation, or with more difficulties also for these big institutions, maybe it is time to think about alternatives, or at least how to reform these institutions. And maybe actors from developing countries, or more generally from the global south, can have a voice in that, and give ideas that are maybe also different from what has been the common practice in these institutions, which have always been Western-led and with the United States as a key player and so on. And looking back at GANEFO might be one way of entering the debate and to bring in ideas. It doesn't mean that we copy things from GANEFO. We have to see GANEFO in the context of the 60s, but at least to talk about agencies of countries that have not been so visible in the sports arena, and to provide maybe more agency to them, and maybe to provide some new ideas, and maybe to start it small and maybe go away from these really huge giga events such as the Olympics, and maybe say sports events should be something more local, and thus also speak more to the people where the event takes place. But yeah, I think I'm starting to come up with many different ideas, but it might also be an agenda for young people in Indonesia to think about this. May I ask something? Because I know that Indonesia, or at least Jokowi, has announced Indonesian interest of hosting the Olympic Games sometime in the future. Is that actually a topic that is publicly discussed, or you as students or members of a university? Are you aware of it? Do you have an opinion about it? Do you discuss that as well? Well, if someone wants to give a comment or ask a question in Indonesian, you feel more comfortable, dalam bahasa Indonesia juga boleh, ya.
Professor Friederike, if you don't mind to give a bit comment to what I said. Oke, dalam bahasa Indonesia. Saya tadi tertarik ketika Profesor mengatakan tentang agency, ya. Jadi bagaimana GANEFO itu bisa dianggap sebagai sebuah bentuk agency, apalagi kemudian dihubungkan dengan isu dekolonialisasi. Menurut saya itu sangat menarik, dan saat ini dekolonialisasi ini nampaknya menjadi sebuah term, sebuah istilah yang menjadi makin kuat, ya, terutama di studi-studi tentang Asia Tenggara. Jadi menurut Ibu, apakah ke depan begitu, ya, studi-studi apakah misalnya GANEFO itu bisa juga menjadi semacam antitesa begitu terhadap kolonialisasi, ataupun kemudian juga menjadi satu titik poin yang penting gitu untuk melihat dekolonialisasi. Maybe my question is very confusing because I myself try to figure it out what is it about. Tapi maksud saya ketika melihat itu sebagai agensi, nampak sekali bahwa memperlihatkan kekuatan dari negara-negara yang dulunya dianggap sebagai backward itu ternyata mampu mengambil sikap ya di dalam sebuah peta international geopolitics gitu. Dan saya rasa ini kan menjadi sesuatu yang saat ini menjadi sesuatu yang ditunggu-tunggu ya. Artinya kebangkitan pemimpin-pemimpin yang sangat kuat, tapi pada saat yang sama itu juga kuat secara nasional dan kuat secara internasional. Itu sesuatu yang saat ini saya kira eranya berbeda, jadi mungkin jauh lebih sulit begitu.
Yeah, well, I will answer in English. It's a little bit easier, but
Yes.
understanding is very fine.
Yeah.
I think that's a key point. So there's ongoing research, and now there's a strong commitment to decolonize all kinds of aspects when we look at research, when we look at political settings and so on. And often it's more about looking at the power relationship and to unmask the power behind certain settings, or when still the strong countries behind certain political decisions. But it also means to look at countries that are considered as developing or still in this colonial background, that they actually have agency, and they already in very early phases have been able to display their ideas on an international stage. And this is the reason why I think to look at GANEFO is such a fruitful thing to contribute to the discussion of decolonizing, because Indonesia was not passive and not on the receiving side, but very much trying to put itself on the stage.
Yeah.
We still have to consider that, of course, there were many difficulties within the country, and it was struggling. But to see this as an example that it's coming out of the colonial situation doesn't mean that a country is just weak and just needs help from the outside, but it's really about trying to understand so who was what was the Indonesian nation and how was it displayed, and to have the sports event as one important platform to really show capability and new ideas. I mean, to come up with something like a new ideology, although this idea of the new emerging forces did not really prolong, but we can maybe learn from that, that it is possible to come up with new ideas, also in many different settings and in many different countries, and maybe not to be that hesitant about it. Also, maybe nowadays, from an Indonesian perspective, to play a role in global politics. And I see in Indonesia also going in that direction, like hosting the G20 and trying to be relevant in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Asia, and maybe also in the world. and the reforms of global sports institutions might be more successful if it's from maybe more from countries from the global south, bringing this experience of decolonization or having this long heritage. But of course, it's also a kind of a challenging process, and maybe linking it again to research questions. Nowadays, we often see this question of how to decolonize certain aspects of politics or of life in general, and to decolonize sports events is certainly something we also have to put on the agenda, and to do research on that. And maybe it's really also something where we need cooperation between different countries. And yeah, well, I would be very open to continue the discussion about decolonizing sports and sports events and the role of Indonesia, and maybe from the Indonesian side there's some interest as well.
Thank you so much. I just want to inform to Professor Friederike, and then also for all those who are coming here attending this discussion, that next year our university, Universitas Airlangga, will be the host for ICAS conference. Yeah, so we are going together, we are working together with IAS Leiden for hosting. I think it's very iconic conference for those who are studying Asian scholarship. Yeah, so it means that I also want to invite Professor Friederike to come in person in Surabaya next year. We plan to make it in July and August next year. Yeah. Okay. I think it will be really good time. So we invite many all. If I can say, no, of course cannot all, because we arranged a conference for 1,050 participants. You know, so hopefully that Professor Friederike will be one of the participants that join with the ICAS next year. And I think sport and politics is also a very important aspect that we may probably we can make a kind of a panel in that ICAS. Yeah, I mean that many students here probably by right now they are still passive, but maybe they are thinking a lot, and then after this it can be a kind of inspiration. Who knows that now you are working for your paper or a thesis, for your final thesis, and then absolutely our meeting today is really important and fruitful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to traveling to Surabaya. It will be wonderful, yes.
Yeah, just when Sukarno was born in Surabaya, and we have many traces of Sukarno in this city. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that makes it very interesting, inspiring.
Thank you so much.
If anybody wants to contact me concerning any questions and so on, I just post my email address. So you're most welcome to contact me in English, dalam bahasa Indonesia, semua bisa. And hopefully we can stay in touch.
Okay.
And
sure.
meet again.
Meet you again.
Yes, thank you.
Meet you again in any corner in the world. At a sport occasion, I think will be great also.
Yes.
Thank you. Mas Khalid.
Okay, everyone, because our time is over, and for Professor Friederike Trotier, do you have any closing statement for the end in this discussion?
I just hope that you continue the discussion that we just started, and yeah, I think it's very open. So it's about sports, it's about politics, and the relationship. It's about agency, and the question of how to decolonize sports, or what does it mean for Indonesia or hosts of events. And yeah, so I just hope that this stays with you, the topic, and yeah, I hope it was interesting and inspiring for everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Meet you again.
Yes, goodbye.
Bye.
Sampai
Oke.
jumpa.
Sampai ketemu lagi, Ibu.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you for everyone, and see you to the next discussion with us, Departemen Studi Club. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Salam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Khalid dan Risa. Sampai ketemu lagi. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.